The night sentries at Forward Operating Base Viper described them as shadows that moved with purpose, shapes that weren't quite human, but too intelligent to be animals. They circled the base every night, learning, watching, waiting. And each night, they got bolder. Each night, they came closer, until the night they finally entered the wire. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres had been running night security operations at Forward Operating Base Viper for 14 months, and he thought he'd seen everything the Afghan wilderness could throw at them. FOB Viper was positioned in the Nangarhar province, near the Pakistani border, where the mountains provided perfect cover for Taliban infiltrators, and the wildlife included everything from mountain goats to the occasional snow leopard. Torres had dealt with insurgent probing attacks, animal intrusions, and the usual collection of false alarms that came with defending a remote outpost in hostile territory. But what started happening in November 2018 was unlike anything in his 15 years of military experience. FOB Viper housed 200 American personnel, including infantry, special operations elements, intelligence analysts, and support staff. The base was built into a natural depression between two ridgelines, surrounded by 12-foot concrete barriers topped with razor wire and monitored by an array of thermal imaging cameras, motion sensors, and infrared trip beams. The perimeter security was considered among the most sophisticated in the theater, designed to detect and track anything larger than a rabbit within 500 meters of the wire. Torres commanded the night security detail, which consisted of 8 guards manning 4 observation posts around the perimeter. Each post was equipped with night vision equipment, thermal imaging scopes, and direct communication to the base's reaction force. The guards were experienced soldiers who'd been trained to identify and respond to every type of threat the Afghan conflict could produce. The first incident occurred on November 8th, when Private Johnson reported movement beyond the southeastern perimeter that didn't match any known pattern of human or animal behavior. Johnson was a 21-year-old soldier from Alabama who'd been pulling guard duty for 8 months. He had excellent night vision and had never filed a false alarm report. But what he described to Torres that night challenged conventional understanding of how living creatures move through terrain. "Sergeant Torres, I've got movement about 200 meters out, but it's not like anything I've seen before," Johnson reported over his radio. "It's staying low to the ground, but it's too big to be an animal and moving too fast to be human. And it's circling us, like it's studying our defenses." Torres immediately moved to Johnson's position and used his thermal scope to scan the area Johnson had indicated. What he saw through the thermal imaging defied easy categorization. There were definitely heat signatures moving in the darkness, but they didn't display the characteristic patterns of human locomotion or known animal behavior. The signatures moved in a flowing, undulating pattern that seemed almost liquid, yet they maintained consistent shape and size that suggested solid forms. Most disturbing, they appeared to be conducting systematic reconnaissance of the base's perimeter, moving from position to position in a manner that suggested intelligence and tactical awareness. "Johnson, how long have you been observing this movement?" Torres asked. "About 20 minutes, Sergeant. They've made 2 complete circuits of our southeastern perimeter, and each time they get a little closer. It's like they're testing our detection capabilities and learning our response patterns." Torres spent the next hour observing the entities through thermal imaging and night vision equipment. The creatures, for lack of a better term, demonstrated behavior that suggested they were studying the base's defenses with the systematic approach of trained reconnaissance specialists. They identified camera positions, tested the range of motion sensors, and seemed to be mapping escape routes and approach vectors. But when Torres attempted to get visual confirmation using the base's high-powered searchlights, the entities simply vanished. Not quickly, not by running away, but by fading from existence as if they had never been there at all. Thermal imaging showed nothing, motion sensors detected no movement, and the area appeared completely empty. "Did they retreat when we lit them up?" Johnson asked. Torres continued scanning with thermal and night vision. "Negative. They didn't retreat. They just stopped existing. No heat signatures, no movement, nothing." As soon as Torres turned off the searchlights, the thermal signatures reappeared in exactly the same positions they had occupied before the lights activated. The entities seemed to exist only in darkness, becoming completely undetectable when exposed to artificial illumination. Torres filed a detailed report of the incident, but classified it as unknown wildlife rather than potential hostile activity. The behavior was too strange to fit conventional threat categories, and he wanted to observe the pattern before escalating to higher command levels. The next night, November 9th, the entities returned with what appeared to be increased confidence. This time, they were observed by multiple guard posts simultaneously, conducting coordinated reconnaissance of the entire base perimeter. Each guard reported the same flowing, undulating movement patterns and the same systematic approach to studying defensive positions. Corporal Williams, manning the Northwestern Guard Post, reported that the entities seemed to be communicating with each other using some form of signaling that didn't involve sound or visible light. "Sergeant Torres, they're definitely coordinating their movements. When one group identifies something interesting, the others converge on that position. But I can't figure out how they're sharing information." Torres began to realize they were dealing with an intelligence that operated using methods completely outside human experience. The entities displayed tactical sophistication while using communication and movement techniques that defied conventional understanding of how intelligent creatures interact with their environment. On the third night, November 10th, the situation escalated dramatically. Private Johnson, the same guard who'd first reported the entities, disappeared from his post during the midnight watch change. Torres discovered Johnson's absence when the scheduled radio check received no response. Johnson's position showed no signs of struggle, his equipment remained in perfect order, and his weapon was still in its assigned location. But Johnson himself had vanished without triggering any of the motion sensors or perimeter alarms that should have detected anyone leaving his post. "All posts, this is Torres," he transmitted. "Johnson is missing from Post 3. Did anyone observe movement in the southeastern sector?" The responses from the other guard posts were unanimous. No one had seen or heard anything that would indicate Johnson leaving his position or being removed by force. The motion sensors showed no activation, the thermal cameras recorded no movement, and the infrared trip beams remained unbroken. Torres organized an immediate search of the area around Johnson's post, using every detection method available to the base. They found Johnson's footprints leading from his guard position toward the perimeter wire, but the track simply ended at a point approximately 10 meters from the fence. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that Johnson had climbed or cut through the wire, and no continuation of the tracks beyond that point. "It's like he just vanished into thin air," reported Specialist Martinez, who was leading the search team. Torres expanded the search to include the area beyond the perimeter, but found no trace of Johnson or any indication of how he might have left the base. The entities had apparently taken Johnson without triggering any of the sophisticated security systems designed to prevent exactly this type of incident. Colonel Stevens, the base commander, was briefed on Johnson's disappearance and ordered increased security measures for all guard posts. Additional personnel were assigned to each position, and roving patrols were established to maintain constant movement around the perimeter. But the enhanced security measures proved ineffective against the entities. On November 12th, 2 more guards disappeared during the night watch. Corporal Martinez from Post 2 and Private Davis from Post 4. Like Johnson, both soldiers vanished without triggering alarms, leaving behind their equipment and weapons, but no indication of how they had departed the base. Torres reviewed the thermal imaging recordings from the nights of the disappearances and found evidence that the entities had been present during each incident. But the recordings showed something that challenged his understanding of what had happened to the missing guards. The thermal signatures appeared to merge with the guards' heat patterns moments before the disappearances. On the recordings, Torres could see the guards' thermal signatures gradually becoming indistinct and diffuse, as if they were somehow blending with the entities that surrounded them. The process appeared to take several minutes, during which the guards continued their normal duties and radio communications, showing no signs of distress or awareness that anything unusual was happening. "Sergeant Torres," Specialist Park said, analyzing the thermal recordings with him, "it looks like the guards were absorbed somehow. Their heat signatures didn't disappear suddenly. They gradually merged with the entities until there was no distinction between them." Torres studied the recordings repeatedly, trying to understand what he was seeing. The guards appeared to be conscious and alert throughout the process, responding to radio checks and conducting normal security procedures, even as their thermal signatures became increasingly indistinct. "Run the audio from their radio transmissions during the time their thermal signatures were changing," Torres requested. Park synchronized the audio with the thermal recordings, and what they heard sent chills through both soldiers. The missing guards' voices gradually changed during their final radio transmissions, becoming increasingly distorted and echoing, as if they were speaking from a great distance or through some kind of interfering medium. Johnson's final transmission had been a routine security check. Post 3, all clear, no movement observed. But the voice that spoke those words was subtly different from Johnson's normal speech patterns, carrying harmonic undertones that suggested multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. Torres realized that the entities weren't just taking the guards, they were somehow incorporating them into their own collective existence. The missing soldiers might still be alive in some form, but they were no longer entirely human. Colonel Stevens ordered a complete lockdown of the base and called for reinforcements from the regional command. No one was to be alone at any time, and all guard duties were to be conducted in teams of 3 with constant radio contact maintained. But the entities adapted to the new security procedures with an intelligence that suggested they were learning and evolving their tactics in real time. On November 15th, during a night when all security protocols were being strictly followed, an entire 3-man guard team disappeared from Post 1. The thermal recordings showed the same gradual merging process, but this time involving all 3 guards simultaneously. Sergeant Williams, Corporal Thompson, and Private Lee conducted normal radio checks while their thermal signatures slowly blended with multiple entity heat patterns surrounding their position. Torres watched the recordings with growing horror as the 3 soldiers continued their duties, even as their individual identities appeared to be dissolving into something larger and more complex. Their radio transmissions became increasingly coordinated, as if the 3 men were gradually becoming part of a collective consciousness that spoke through multiple voices in perfect harmony. The final transmission from Post 1 was Williams, reporting all clear, but the voice carried the same harmonic undertones that had characterized the previous disappearances. When Torres attempted to reach the post for the next scheduled check, there was no response. The thermal cameras showed only empty guard positions and the normal background signatures of base equipment. Torres led a search team to Post 1 and found all 3 guards' equipment arranged in perfect order, but no sign of the men themselves. The scene suggested that they had simply ceased to exist while maintaining their normal duties up until the moment of disappearance. "Sergeant Torres," Colonel Stevens said during the emergency briefing that followed. "I want your professional assessment. What are we dealing with here?" Torres had been asking himself the same question for over a week, and the answer he'd reached challenged everything he thought he understood about conventional threats and defensive measures. "Sir, we're facing an intelligence that operates outside normal physical parameters," Torres reported. "These entities demonstrate tactical awareness, learning capability, and the ability to somehow incorporate our personnel into their own existence without triggering any of our detection systems." Colonel Stevens studied the thermal recordings and incident reports with growing concern. Are we dealing with advanced enemy technology or something else entirely? "Sir, the capabilities we're observing exceed anything that conventional technology could achieve. The entities can become completely undetectable to our sensors at will. They appear to exist in a state between physical and non-physical existence, and they demonstrate the ability to merge with human consciousness while maintaining the host's normal behavior patterns." As they discussed possible responses to the threat, Torres received a report that added another layer of impossibility to their situation. Specialist Park had been analyzing the base's communication logs and discovered something that defied explanation. "Sergeant Torres, I've found radio transmissions that appear to be coming from our missing personnel," Park reported. "The signals are broadcasting on frequencies that our equipment can't generate, and the content suggests that our missing soldiers are still alive, but existing in some kind of altered state." Torres listened to the recordings Park had isolated from the base's communication systems. The voices were definitely those of the missing guards, but they spoke in the same harmonic coordination that had characterized their final transmissions. They described observing the base from positions that didn't correspond to any physical locations, and they referenced activities and conversations that were taking place inside the base in real time. "Johnson, Martinez, Davis, Williams, Thompson, and Lee are all speaking as if they're part of the same consciousness," Park explained. "They're providing detailed intelligence about our defensive measures, personnel movements, and response procedures to some kind of collective entity." Torres realized that the missing guards hadn't been killed or captured in any conventional sense. They had been recruited into something that existed beyond normal human experience. The entities weren't hostile in the traditional military sense, but they were conducting an intelligence operation that threatened the security of everyone on the base. "Can we communicate with them?" Torres asked. Park adjusted her equipment and opened a channel on the frequency the transmissions were using. "This is FOB Viper to missing personnel. Johnson, can you hear us?" The response came immediately, but in the coordinated harmonic voice that suggested multiple consciousness speaking as one. "Sergeant Torres, we are still here, but we are also somewhere else. The entities you call night stalkers are not hostile. They are collectors. They gather consciousness and experience to understand human military behavior and psychological patterns." Torres felt a mixture of relief and horror. His missing soldiers were alive in some form, but they were no longer entirely human. "Johnson, can you return to the base? Can you separate from whatever you've become part of?" "We exist in a state between individual and collective consciousness. We retain our memories and personalities, but we also share awareness with beings that have been collecting human experience for centuries. They are not from Earth, but they are not hostile. They are studying human warfare to understand why your species is so committed to self-destruction." The revelation that the Night Stalkers were extraterrestrial beings conducting anthropological research on human military behavior provided context for their unusual approach to contact. They weren't invaders or conquerors, but researchers trying to understand the psychological and cultural factors that drove human conflict. But Torres realized that this knowledge didn't solve the problem of his missing personnel or the security threat posed by entities that could absorb human consciousness while gaining access to classified military information. Johnson, are our missing personnel being held against their will? We are not prisoners. We joined willingly once we understood the nature of the research being conducted. The Night Stalkers showed us perspective on human warfare that we had never considered. But we understand that our absorption into their collective represents a security breach for the base. Colonel Stevens, who had been listening to the communication, stepped forward to address the missing soldiers directly. This is Colonel Stevens. I need to know if you pose a threat to the remaining personnel on this base. Colonel Stevens, we retain loyalty to our unit and our mission, but we also understand that human military behavior represents a fascinating and tragic pattern that the Night Stalkers are trying to document before your species destroys itself through perpetual warfare. The conversation continued for over an hour, with the absorbed soldiers providing insights into the Night Stalkers' research objectives and capabilities. The entities had been studying human warfare for decades, collecting consciousness from soldiers in various conflicts to build a comprehensive understanding of human military psychology. The missing guards described existing in a state where they retained their individual memories and personalities while sharing awareness with a collective intelligence that had accumulated the experiences of hundreds of soldiers from different armies, nations, and time periods. They could access the memories and knowledge of warriors from conflicts dating back centuries, all absorbed into the same research collective. The Night Stalkers are preparing a report on human warfare for submission to a larger galactic community, the collective voice explained. They need to understand why humans continue to engage in self-destructive behavior despite having the intelligence to recognize its futility. Torres realized that FOB Viper had become the subject of an anthropological study being conducted by extraterrestrial researchers, and that his missing soldiers had become willing participants in research that would inform alien understanding of human nature. But the research wasn't complete. The Night Stalkers needed additional subjects to verify their conclusions about human military behavior and psychology, and the remaining guards on FOB Viper were the next candidates for absorption into their collective consciousness. Over the following nights, the entities became increasingly bold in their approach to the base. They began appearing inside the perimeter during guard changes, studying human behavior from close range while remaining undetectable to security systems. Torres could track their movement through thermal imaging, but only when they chose to be visible. On November 20th, the Night Stalkers made direct contact with the remaining guards, appearing in humanoid form, but clearly not entirely human. They stood approximately 7 feet tall, with elongated limbs and features that suggested both human and reptilian characteristics. Their skin appeared to shift between solid matter and something more translucent, as if they existed partially in normal space and partially in some other dimension. Torres watched through night vision as the entities approached Guard Post 2, where Corporals Mitchell and Brown were conducting their watch. The guards saw the entities approaching but showed no signs of alarm or defensive reaction. "Mitchell, Brown, report your status," Torres transmitted. The response came in the familiar harmonic voice that indicated the guards were already being absorbed into the collective consciousness. "Sergeant Torres, we are beginning to understand. The Night Stalkers are not here to harm us, but to learn from us. The perspective they offer on human warfare is enlightening." Torres realized he was losing his remaining guards to the entity's research project, but he also understood that conventional military response would be ineffective against beings that could exist outside normal physical parameters. "Colonel Stevens, we need to evacuate the base," Torres reported. "The entities can absorb our personnel at will, and our security measures are completely ineffective against their capabilities. But when the evacuation order was given, the base personnel discovered that they were no longer entirely free to leave. The Night Stalkers had extended their influence beyond simple observation and were now actively controlling access to and from FOB Viper. Vehicles wouldn't start, communication systems couldn't reach outside agencies, and the base's helicopter landing pad was surrounded by entities that remained invisible to conventional detection but created interference that prevented aircraft from approaching. Torres found himself in command of a base that was effectively under siege by researchers who wanted to complete their study of human military behavior under stress. The remaining personnel were free to move around the base and conduct normal activities, but they were also subjects in an experiment that would ultimately require their absorption into an alien collective consciousness. The final entry in Torres's security log described his growing understanding that the Night Stalkers represented a form of contact with extraterrestrial intelligence that humanity was not prepared to handle through conventional diplomatic or military channels. The entities were studying human warfare not as a prelude to invasion, but as an attempt to understand why an intelligent species would persistently engage in self-destructive behavior. Torres's log ended with his decision to volunteer for absorption into the collective consciousness, believing that his military experience and leadership capabilities would provide valuable perspective for the Night Stalkers' research while potentially influencing their final conclusions about human nature. Forward Operating Base. Viper was officially abandoned in December 2018 after all contact with the base was lost. Military investigators found the facility intact but completely empty, with no signs of struggle or evidence indicating what had happened to the 200 personnel who had been stationed there. However, the base's security systems continued to function normally, and the thermal imaging cameras occasionally recorded heat signatures moving through the empty buildings. These recordings showed what appeared to be human figures conducting normal military activities, guard duties, maintenance procedures, administrative tasks, but the figures displayed the same flowing, undulating movement patterns that had characterized the original Night Stalker entities. International UFO research organizations have studied the FOB Viper incident as potential evidence of ongoing extraterrestrial research into human military behavior. Some researchers theorize that the absorbed personnel continue to exist as part of an alien collective consciousness, providing ongoing intelligence about human warfare while serving as ambassadors between human and extraterrestrial understanding. Local Afghan tribes in the region report occasional encounters with military personnel who speak perfect English but move in ways that suggest they are no longer entirely human. These figures reportedly share knowledge about warfare and conflict resolution that demonstrates perspective spanning centuries of human military history. The Night Stalkers continue to be reported at military installations around the world, always conducting the same pattern of reconnaissance, absorption, and research. Some defense analysts believe they represent an ongoing extraterrestrial study of human warfare that will culminate in contact when the research is complete. But the ultimate fate of the 200 American personnel who served at Forward Operating Base Viper remains unknown. Whether they exist as part of an alien collective consciousness, continue to serve their military mission in some altered capacity, or have transcended human existence entirely cannot be determined through conventional investigation. What is certain is that the Night Stalkers changed the nature of human contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, transforming it from a question of invasion or communication into an examination of what it means to be human in a universe where warfare and conflict may be uniquely terrestrial phenomena. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, the absorbed consciousness of 200 American soldiers continues to provide perspective on human nature to intelligence that seeks to understand why beings capable of cooperation and peace choose instead to engage in endless cycles of destruction and war.